Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talks with Gallagher, where we have conversations that inspire and empower. Today, we have Dr. Craig Miller, and he has been involved in speaking and counseling for over 40 years, a variety of families and couples in the medical and mental health and church settings. And he holds a master's degree in social work from Michigan State University and a master's degree in health Services Administration from the University of Detroit. He's been honored with multiple listings in the Who's Who's in Executives and Professionals. And Craig, with his wife, they've been married for over 40 years, and they have two married adult children and grandchildren. And I've had the honor to have Dr. Craig Miller on multiple occasions, and I'm just so thrilled to have him on again today, talking about overcoming anxiety, which is a really important topic that seems to be really causing a problem for a lot of people, with anxiety and how to deal with it, how to overcome it. And so today we're going to give you some practical tips on how to navigate that on your day-to-day life. So thank you again, Craig, for being on with us today.
You're welcome. I have a lot of medical background, so I'm not actually a doctor, but I have a couple of master's degrees and I have a lot of medical background. I was a first responder years ago, and I've been in mental health for 46 years. So, and working in hospitals and outpatients. So I have a lot of background in the medical and mental health. So, but that's why people often think that. But I appreciate having me on the show. And this issue about anxiety is really critical because I just gave you an example. So one of the places I worked was Masterpiece Counseling. I co-owned it 31 years ago. And we had about 8 or 9 therapists there. And typically we have about 25 to 30 on a wait list, which is very typical for that size. So in 2020, when this thing called COVID just started in 2019, and then in February of 2020, within about a little bit over 2 weeks, our waiting list went from 25 to 90.
Wow.
Because of mostly anxiety and the depression. And that was an epidemic issue. That was one of the mental health fallbacks or consequences of this thing because of the alienation, the isolation, the fears that was going on. I mean, when I have a person coming in my office, the first thing I tell them that they have anxiety, I just say, stop watching the news. It's just terrible. So let's get into this, talk a little bit about how large this issue is, which is on a local scale, that's what was happening. But nationally, it's about 19% of population have anxiety. I mean, that's a pretty high amount. Interestingly enough, then the adolescents have it about 38%, and adults have about 31%. I mean, when you break it down. So adolescents have actually more anxiety than adults do. And it's simply because they're trying to fit in. Now, we have to talk about why is this going on? Why do we have so much anxiety? Well, I have found over the years is a lot about fears that are happening around us, the uncertainty in the world, and uncertainty starting from childhood. So think about it. So when we're born with simply temperament, which is strong-willed or compliant. And that's about it. So it's pretty much our personality is not created. So either strong-willed or compliant, and then you are born into this environment. Now, John, who creates the environment? It's your caregivers. So if my caregivers are anxious people, if the environment's anxious, I'm going to be anxious because I'm looking to them. It's all what's created. Now, let's go back even further. I think we might have talked about this on another one of the other shows, but anxiety can literally start in utero. Think about it. If your mother, who is pregnant with you in your womb, if the mom's anxious a lot, the mom will create, her adrenal gland will create adrenaline. Adrenaline is a fight or flight chemical to help you either run away or fight it. And that then washes over the whole body of the mother, and then it washes over the baby in the womb. So if the mom's anxious, the baby becomes anxious, and then the baby begins to pull adrenaline out of its own adrenal gland. But of course, it exhausts it right away because it's so small, if it's developed at all. What happens is the baby becomes anxious. And if the mom doesn't clear that up, the baby then could have hypervigilant. They could have their own anxiety disorders, ADD, ADHD. That's what you're born with from the womb. And then if you're born into a home where there's a lot of chaos, fighting, arguing with mom and dad, a lot of anger going on, mother's anxious, dad's anxious as a role model, then that's PTSD. So PTSD can start in the womb as well as in the home. Well, because we're a little kid, if nobody's there to tell you differently, you're going to think that's the way you deal with life. So there's a lot of people now that just have anxiety, and just in general, they just have anxiety because it's always been that way. So it's amazing what we're realizing is that I get a lot of people that come into me that have been anxious their whole life, but that's kind of like at this foundational level. This is kind of what they know. And as they get older, other things happen that makes them even more anxious. So now we deal with it mostly in our 40s and 50s, and sometimes 30s. Depends on what's going on around us. So let's back up even more. So our mom and dad is our role model in terms of how to deal with life. And so if our mom and dad are strong people, this goes back to that uncertainty issue. So if mom and dad are strong people, they're able to get through life, and they're there to comfort you. Because if I get anxious, I get upset about something, what happens is I will have a struggle to let go of an uncertain or anxious or negative experience unless I have an equal or greater comfort experience to make me safe enough to let it go.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm curious when it comes to anxiety, because sometimes it seems like some people think, oh well, this is just how, it's part of my personality. But then when I think about that, I'm thinking about, well, that's probably a lie. But then how did that particular mindset form over time as being like kind of like a stronghold mindset type of dynamic? And then also wondering okay, when it comes to someone's personality, as a child, does that get shaped by those caregivers, those parents, or is it just something that's inherent, or all the above? So, I'm sure there's people wondering about some are probably finding it more difficult probably than others to break free from anxiety.
Okay, excellent question. So think about it this way. Since I don't really know about life yet, I'll be born into this system, into this environment, and whatever the mom and dad, let's say if up to about 8 years old, actually up to about 11, I'm just an emotional being. My brain really doesn't start developing until puberty, which is like 11 or 12. But definitely up to 8 years old, I respond emotionally to the environment. So if my dad or mom come home from work and they're upset, it has nothing to do with me as a kid, but they're upset at work. Because we're very narcissistic, it's really all about us. Whatever I see going on around us, I'll respond to that, believing that I did something wrong. So if my dad or mom are angry people, or they yell a lot, or this kind of a way of a life of turmoil, I'm going to be anxious unless somebody comforts me to let me know that it's not true. So I talk a lot about this. And by the way, to help people, and I'll just say this early on, if you really want more information about this, because I'm only going to nip the surface of it. So I recommend getting this book. It's one of my latest books. It's Breaking Emotional Barriers to Healing. And I recommend it's on Amazon, and it's on, obviously paperback and Kindle, and then I believe it's on ebook, and then it's also audio. But what's good about this book is it helps you know what the origin of it is, and and I'm going to talk a little bit a little later about how to get rid of it. Okay, so back to your question. So if my mom and dad, if something happens, as I mentioned before,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm hurt about something or I'm anxious, I need someone to comfort me, to comfort my anxiety, and then when I'm comforted, I become safe, and when I feel safe, I feel loved. And love casts out all fears, as the Bible says. So once I feel safe by my mom or dad, I'm going to relax whatever I'm feeling because it's okay now. That's why kids can go from hurt to joy like in 60 seconds if you give them a little love hug, a little love pat on the back, like it's going to be okay. So they need is equal or greater reassurance to cancel out the pain. But as you mentioned before, if it's a way of life, like that's the way I see two types of people, either kind of a way of life, that's it's always been anxious. I either feel anxious, and my parents are anxious, or it's episodic, like this happened and that happened. Like in ministry, oftentimes in ministry and even psychotherapy, they'll go to a moment or they'll go to an event and we can work on that event and release it, which is good. But most ministries don't know how to deal with, well, this is the way I always feel. Like you said, I've always felt this way. That's because that's the way it was growing up. It was always that way. So the best thing to do in my ministry is you have them go back to that time and you see Jesus there with you, or a comfort person like an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent standing between you and the event. And especially most people will think, like, I can't remember it. I mean, I don't know where it was. I don't know when it started. Well, it's because it was always that way. So I think of myself, picture yourself with your eyes closed with somebody giving you a hug that's a comfort, or Jesus just standing there. What do you think it would be like for a child? Just guess. And we're always going to find it. Like, guess, what do you think it was like to live in that home? And you know what, typically, John, whatever they're feeling now, we typically continue the same feeling now in adulthood as we did in childhood. We just don't realize that became our normal. So when I get hurt, as what you're saying, if I get hurt as a child and nobody cancels that out by hugging me, loving on me so I can relax and let it go, and nobody tells me the difference, I'm going to take that negative response feeling that I have and I'm going to adapt my life around it to live with it. And then the longer I live with it, the more it becomes my identity because that's all I know. And that becomes my normal. And that's what a lot of people live with. So,
Wow.
let me go over two types of anxieties. All right.
Okay. And I do have a question that came to mind as you were sharing what you just shared,
Go
but
ahead.
I don't
Go
want
ahead.
to.
Go ahead. I can always get back to it.
Okay, great. How does the role of perception play in the way we deal with anxiety in our daily life?
That's a
Because
good
it
question.
seems like sometimes perception is a reality that we think is real in that given circumstance, but it's actually it's not actually reality, and so there wasn't really a need to have anxiety about it in the first place. So how do we I guess I think um, is there a maybe I know this might sound strange, but a healthy anxiety where it's like, okay, I'm knowing the difference between, okay, I'm supposed to have these types of emotional response because I'm understanding it to be this way, but if I'm not perceiving it to be what it actually is, then that's probably an unhealthy way of anxiety, and then maybe that can become a cycle, right?
Yeah. Okay. So let me break that up into two things. All right. And no, you
Okay.
did great because I'll see that's when I work with people, I can't argue what they're thinking or feeling because
Hmm.
their perception is their 100%.
Hmm.
So as a child, as I mentioned, as a child, definitely under 11 and definitely under 8, if my dad is angry about something or my mom and has nothing to do with me, even if my mom and dad argue about something between themselves,
Hmm.
I'll think I need to fix it.
Hmm.
And I think it's about, especially if a kid's name comes up, then I must have made them feel that way. So I'm a bad boy or bad girl.
Hmm.
Now, that's my perception. It's not true because my dad's angry about work or angry about mom expecting to do something when he should be anyway, because he's a
Hmm.
knucklehead or whatever, and he's not doing what he should do to take responsibility for all the kids, whatever. But that's their stuff. But I don't know that. So my perception is perceptions start really early, and I create that perception and out of the negativity unless somebody tells me different. That's my point about somebody needs to cancel out the negative perception, give you the truth, so the truth will set you free.
Hmm.
Okay,
Right,
so
exactly.
my dad is an authority figure, my mom's an authority figure. They're angry about something. When they get angry, I get upset inside and I get anxious. And so
Hmm.
nobody tells me different, that it's not my fault. So I'm going to take that in, adapt my life around. Like I've got to clean the house. I got to do this and be good grades, be a good girl, a good boy,
Hmm.
because I don't want them to be upset. I need to make, because if they don't, especially if I don't get a lot of love from them, I'm thinking because I did something wrong. So I have
Hmm.
to do what I can to make them love me. And that creates a perception
Hmm.
that I'm always having to do something to create something good, or I'm not
Hmm.
good enough, or poor confidence, or I'm afraid of conflict, or I'm afraid of people raising their voice, or I'm afraid of authority figures. It's a
Hmm.
perception. So I go into adulthood, and then if nobody tells me differently as a child, I'll have the same perception as an adult. So my boss gets upset, I'll think I did
Hmm.
something wrong. It has nothing to do with you, or the fact that somebody has um, a some kind of comment and I take it wrong. It's
Hmm.
because my parents had comments and I took that wrong. So we're always transferring what I know, my perception, how I feel, how I react into adulthood. And then I
Hmm.
live the same way and I marry the same person and I continue the same response.
Wow, that is really profound. I think a lot of people don't realize how much their childhood uh, influence in how they have built a certain idea of the world has a significant influence in how they interact as an adult on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's a very important key to unlocking, breakthrough regarding someone's uh, just coming into a more healthy place in their adulthood emotionally, right?
Exactly. So, a couple of things. So, as a child, in childhood, our external world determines our internal belief of reality. So,
Hmm.
as a child, whatever's going on around me, my parents fighting and whatever's happening and making me feel upset because they're fighting, or making me feel wrong, like I'm doing something wrong. So, that external world creates my internal belief of my reality. That's the perception. And
Hmm.
then when I go into adulthood, John, then the perception continues that my internal belief of reality determines my external world.
Hmm.
So if I'm afraid because an authority figure in childhood raised their voice and it made me afraid and nobody told me different, I'm going to take that same perception that I need to be afraid when authority figures in my adulthood raise their voice that I need to be afraid.
Hmm.
So what happens is negative, this is amazing, a negative experience reaction in adulthood typically is unresolved childhood experiences that have
Hmm.
not been healed.
Wow.
Like
Wow.
almost 100%. Because think about it. So when I speak at churches, I do a lot of this churches, and I work with healing teams to learn what do you do if you don't get healed. And again, all this information that we're talking about right now, again, is in this book. All right. And so, and you can get that on Amazon, or it's on audio if you and paperback. But they can get more information about what I talk about on my website, which is insights with an S, insightsfromtheheart.com. Insightsfromtheheart.com. And what I'm finding is, so let's go to the second part of your question is about the types of anxiety, healthy and
Yeah.
unhealthy. And so that's a great segue because that is it. There's two types of anxieties. One is a normal anxiety, like buying a house or buying a car or taking a test.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty normal because something's new. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sure about it, but anxiety, God created anxiety. It just said you just don't want to continue with it, and because it's not healthy. So anxiety is good as a warning. It keeps us alert. It helps us realize there's something not right. I need to be more alert. So I become anxious. But as you were saying, what happens next? So the unhealthy anxiety is where you have normal anxiety up to a point, but once that issue is done, once you're done with the test, once you bought the car and you're satisfied with it, the anxiety should go away. The unhealthy anxiety is if it doesn't go away, like you're always having it, you're always worried about the car. If my mom or dad were a worry people, they're always worrying about the next thing going to happen. That means that I need to be worried about life because something bad may happen, especially if something does happen. What it does is it makes me think like it's going to. So I always have to be worried in case something happens. Well, what I teach people, anxiety is not an origin, it's always a result. Anxieties are always a result of something. Now, you
Mm-hmm.
can have anxiety from some medications. That can be a side effect and so on. But overall, if you're constantly anxious and there's no stopping point, that's an unhealthy anxiety. And that's typically learned.
That's learned behavior over time.
Yeah.
Interesting. And can there be a type of anxiety where the subconscious is influencing that learned behavior?
Yeah. And the subconscious, by the way, comes from the childhood where I put it
Mm,
away and I
mm,
don't remember it, like it's just there.
mm-hmm,
So I'll give you an example. Starting in utero, let's go to utero example. So this woman
mm-hmm,
was 24 years old. I was praying with her, she asked for prayer. She's had anxiety her whole life. She doesn't know when it started. It's always been there. And it's worse when she's in a car.
mm-hmm,
Okay, so she doesn't know where it came from. She doesn't understand. So I prayed. He said, Lord, I ask Father, Holy Spirit, bring up from the bottom, just from the depth of her soul, what is it, where this is coming from? And God brought to her a memory from her mom telling her that when her mom was 8 months pregnant with this girl, with this woman, the mom was driving a car and had an accident where another car T-boned her in the driver's side. So the mom was hurt physically, but the baby was not. This girl was not, or this woman. And so what happened was the mom became very anxious about that, and then from then on was anxious about driving cars. So in utero, this woman this 24-year-old took on that anxiety. So what I did is, and this is in the book, Breaking Emotional Barriers to Healing. So I had her think of a comfort person. Now she used Jesus and her grandma. So Jesus was she knew Jesus was powerful, but grandma gave her an experience of being comforted. She hadn't really been comforted per se in a realistic sense from Jesus, but she was from her grandma. So grandma represented the opposite.
mm,
See, that's where I miss it, where I'll be real honest, and this is part of the solution. In a lot of ministries, they ask you to put Jesus there to heal it. Now, Jesus, as far as I'm concerned, God can heal it anytime, anywhere, with anybody. I just
mm-hmm,
believe that, right?
mm-hmm,
But my ministry, insightsfromtheheart.com, is primarily about what if they don't get healed. And that's typically
mm-hmm,
the people that I see. And so the reason why we don't get healed is because I'm still afraid. Just because I'm coming up to her, I'm an authority figure. She doesn't know me. So I could pray for God to heal her. And he very well should and could. I expect it. But if he doesn't, it's because we're stopping it because there's some emotions stronger than what I know better. Like early traumatic emotions are always stronger and bigger than my logic to know better as an adult. See, I know most
Wow.
of our relationships with God, in church even, is a cognitive approach. It's like I know mentally about God. I know he loves me. I know he's powerful. I know he's going to do this. I know I'm deserving, but I don't necessarily feel it. Because here's another reason why. People don't realize that when we're born, we don't know who God is.
Mm-hmm.
So our earthly father is our first representation of God. And how that came across, if your God was if your first God, meaning your daddy, was a protector, a lover, a hugger, and a listener, and there for you, and you had a great relationship, then that's the relationship you're going to have with your second God.
Hmm.
And this is all based on Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way they should go, and when they're older, they won't depart from it.
Planting those seeds at an early age really does establish a root system over time
Yeah.
into your adulthood, right?
Yeah. So this woman saw Jesus. I had her close her eyes and just see Jesus with touching her in her womb. Actually, I usually have him hold her stomach, and my wife's going to have her touch there, but I'll touch her shoulder and her head. I had another woman there helping me, so she also put her hand there. Said, picture Jesus and your mom loving on that little girl, protecting her from your mom. And you see yourself letting it go and just see yourself giving a little love hug, like it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. That's why I had my hand on her back and just comforting her. And when she felt comforted in a real way and knew what the comfort of her grandma was like and the power of Jesus was like, she was able to let that go. Within minutes, it was gone. And she didn't have the anxiety anymore. And this was
Wow.
all done in like 7 minutes.
Wow, that's amazing. Wow.
Yeah. And so the same thing happens in adulthood. I mean, I had a guy. So remember now, in childhood, our external world determines our internal belief of reality. And then in adulthood, our internal belief of reality determines my external world. So I had a man who was, let's see, he said he was 59. He came to my office. He said, for 53 years, as long as I remember, I've had an anxiety problem.
Hmm.
And so I did the same thing. And I said, what does it feel like? It's overwhelming inside. And I get this, it's kind of like this small foundational feeling of anxiety. It gets bigger every once in a while. So I asked him to close his eyes and asked the Holy Spirit to bring up from the depth of his soul where he might have felt that before. He said, I realized I felt it just living in my home. I said, just think of that little boy you as a little boy living in your home. What was it like for you? What would it have been like? He said, well, living there, my mom and dad were anxious people, especially my mom. And when I saw that, I became anxious, and I always felt I had to be anxious. Later on, what came to his mind was a story his mom told him later as an adult, that which then he put together the pieces that his mom and dad had. There was a brother. This man had a brother who died a couple of years before he was born, but he died as a very young child, like an infant, toddler. And since that time, mom and dad were always anxious that he would die. And so there was this gloom and anxiety in the home since then. And he just put those pieces together. And then so I always ask him how much anxiety you have now, 0 to 10. He said like 8 or 9, depending on how much it is, typically like 5 or 6, just all the time. After we did this technique of seeing, I guess it was maybe it was a grandfather, and just seeing Jesus and them hugging him in the home as a boy, seeing him standing with this grandfather hugging him, and Jesus there with him, standing between him and his parents, like protecting him. And that because he was protected like a child, I feel protected and I can just relax and let that go. So he let that go. The anxiety went down to about a 3. And then I said, Holy Spirit, is there another incident? Yeah, there was another one with his brother he had a brother after he was born to those 2 boys. And something happened with his brother that he got anxious about. So we got rid of that anxiety, and the anxiety went down to 0. So 53 years of anxiety was just gone within about 15 minutes.
Well, that's that's absolutely amazing. I mean, these particular time and tested truth ways of navigating emotional therapy, it's amazing how quickly, when you just submit to the process, how quickly it can be resolved, and how somehow it's so without confronting it in a certain way. It's amazing how long it can linger if you don't deal with it.
Yeah. So most therapies, and I'll be honest, because I'm a licensed therapist, so most therapies and ministries are about symptom focused, and they're talking out the symptom. But you need to realize that, John, anxiety is created by it's an emotion. It was created by by something. So I always tell people when I talk at churches and teach ministry teams how to deal with things when healing doesn't happen, I say anything not of God, anxiety, depression, physical issues. I think we talked about physical issues in your previous show. So anything not of God was given, because it's not from God, it was given to you by a person or a circumstance. Like literally. Well, even if you were born with it, you were still given it. And because you were given something that's not of God, that means it's not yours. That means you can give it away. You just have to determine who gave it to you and when and what it is, and then get rid of it. Now, you don't always remember that, but there's ways to deal with that. Again, it's in my book, Breaking Emotional Barriers to Healing, and basically finding the time in life. Even if you don't remember, just think about living in the home. Or I got another example. So,
sure,
this woman, she's in her late 50s, 2 kids, a husband, and so on. It was at a conference I had somewhere, I think it was in Texas. And she said she's had anxiety her whole life. Doesn't understand and know why. Same thing. And it get worse every once in a while, depending on when it was, what was going on. But she said the biggest part of it was nighttime. She didn't like nighttime. She for her whole life, as an adult, every night she had to go to bed with a nightlight on. And nighttime, she didn't like going to sleep. It was a very gloomy time. It was a very scary time for her. And she'd be anxious during that time. And she kind of feel a smothered time. So I asked to do the same thing. Holy Spirit, take her back to where he felt something like feeling. And I repeated the same kind of feelings. God brought to her something she hadn't thought about in years. Was a story that her mom told her, that when this woman was being born, there was a complication while she was in the birth canal. There was a complication, and they had to transfer the mom to another hospital. So supposedly she was in there for a few hours. And it's well known, it's already documented, well known, that prolonged time in a birth canal creates claustrophobia, which is fear of closed places. And so that's what she had. She didn't realize it. But because it was in a dark, smothering place, and she felt that way, didn't like darkness. She had to have a light. So I did. I took her back to that time, have her see Jesus giving her a hug in a room. The grandma, I think, was a safe person for her. I had my hand on her. We had a couple of females around her, touching her, just comforting her. And she saw herself being comforted well enough that she could give away what she was given, which is the fear. And I said, this is not yours anymore because you're comforted and you're safe now. You can give it away. And she did that. And the next day, the next day at the conference that I was at, I said, how's it going? And she gave her testimony in front of everybody. She said she didn't need her nightlight. The gloominess was gone. The anxiety was gone. She slept through the night. First time in years, she slept through the night without a problem.
Wow. That's fantastic. Wow.
So we don't realize what we're carrying around because it becomes our
Mm-hmm.
normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And anxiety is a result of something. Now, granted, you could have a car accident like a week ago, and you're going to have anxiety. But most medicine in the U.S. is traditional medicine, which is allopathic medicine. Nothing wrong with it. I'm just saying, but they don't
Mm-hmm.
deal with the emotional part.
Mm-hmm.
And sad to say, a lot of ministries don't deal with the emotion either. A lot of churches deny that. I mean, Jesus was a very emotional man, and he had a lot of emotion, and so was David. David was very emotional, and they talk a lot about that. The Bible talks a lot about emotions, and so, for example, even James 5:16, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you may be healed. What is confessing? It's releasing. It's letting it go. It's what's inside. Ephesians 4 has everything about remove bitterness, wrath, anger. I mean, we're supposed to let this stuff go. And so Psalms 40, verse 1, God pays special attention to your tears. Wait a minute, that means you're supposed to have tears, and he's going to cover you. But if your first God didn't let you have tears, you're not going to have those to give away to your second God.
Wow.
So my point is that if something happened even a week ago, deal with the physical trauma and the emotional trauma. So here's how I show people. So typically we have a event. We always have an event that is hurtful, a trauma. And with a trauma event always creates a emotional trauma that comes off of that, all right? And with every emotion, you always have a belief. For example, my father's yelling. It makes me afraid when people yell. It makes me afraid. And then my belief is that when people yell or raise their voice, I become afraid. Now, I put away the event, and then I live off of the emotional trauma and the belief. If I don't get rid of this, Satan's going to come in and make that worse.
Wow.
Which is all right. Now, in deliverance or ministry in general, they'll go through the spiritual door, which is fine, and they get rid of the Satan, or they get rid of the deliverance, which is fine. But if you don't deal with why he came in the first place, because trauma is the open door for Satan, if you don't get rid of that, then he's going to come back 7 times worse. It says it in the Bible. Now, I personally don't do a lot of deliverance. I can if I need to, but I go through the back door. I find out, I go through the soul door. This is a spiritual door. I go through the soul door. The soul is the mind, will, and emotions. It's not wrong. I'm just saying they gotta add one step. So I'll go through the back door and just think about what the event was, or just living in this situation, and I'll find out what the emotion is. You get rid of the emotion, the belief automatically comes back because I already am good enough. I don't have to do a lot of belief stuff because you're already you're already good enough. You're already deserving of good things. You're already made in God's image. So you get that back automatically when you get rid of the hurtful emotion. And all I got left is in memory, and then Satan has to leave because there's nothing to attach yourself to. So all I get left is the memory. And the memory doesn't mean anything anymore. Then I can forgive people. It doesn't matter. Unforgiveness typically is is an emotion that doesn't let me release it. Get rid of the emotion, and it doesn't matter.
Right. It's nothing that it can attach itself to create that foundation, right?
Yes. So the most important thing is they need to find out where did it come from. Now, it's common where we don't always remember, like where the anxious came from. But what's the feeling you have when you're anxious? What does it feel like to be anxious? I mean, so it's very common that when we're a child, we don't remember. So what was it like growing up in your home? Was it a comforting home? Was it a reassuring home? Was it a loving? Was there a lot of affirmation, or was it negative? Was there a lot of? I had a woman when I was talking about identity. I had a woman whose nickname was her nickname was "stupid idiot" by her dad. He said it all the time, and so I had the hardest time reversing that because it created emotion. And emotion created a belief that I am one. And then when everybody gets upset or so, I get upset, either I get anxious or I get angry. And then I can't get out of those emotions. It stays with me because somebody of greater authority gave me that. Listen, I have a hard time changing what I believe. I will have a hard time believing in myself or God unless somebody of greater authority believes in you first.
Wow.
Same thing
It's
with
that
love.
much influence.
Oh yeah. So same thing with love. I will have a hard time loving we had to do another session on loving your spouse or relationship healing. But I'll have a hard time loving God, being loved, loving my spouse, unless somebody of greater authority loved me first. Because love is learned. Okay, so you got to, and love is learned, and then we transfer that onto our next, into adulthood. And so that comes from our first God, typically, So
Yeah. I know you mentioned earlier in the broadcast about narcissism, and that seems to be a topic or a word that is ever increasingly coming in conversation in healing and dealing with dynamics of people that can be toxic. So I know that's a whole nother ball of wax there, but
let's do another session about relationships and narcissism. Narcissism is a personality disorder. There's there's a whole list of personality disorders, and narcissism is one. And typically it's a learned behavior. It's either I was spoiled, so it's all about me, or I didn't get anything. It was never about me. So I mean, it's typically coming from one of those two things. And then can you get out of it? Oh yeah, you can get out of anything. You can get. Listen, the way the medicine is, or the AMA and all them. Granted, they're doing the best they can with what they know, but all these things can be healed. Yeah, but the person has to want it. They have to allow it. They have to allow it, and they have to allow me to get in there. And so I have a lot of spouses say, my spouse is this and that, and can you pray for them? I said, I'd be glad to pray for them, but do they want it? And
there's a free will involved in the healing process, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and so same thing with anxiety. But the first thing we need to understand, there's two types of anxieties. There's healthy, which helps us to be warned about something happening. And then once that's done, you shouldn't have the anxiety. And then there's unhealthy, which picks up then. I'm always either I'm always having the anxiety, or I have way more than I should given what's going on. Like I'm always afraid something bad's going to happen. I get a lot of people that are afraid, like health worries or financial worries. That's one of the two big ones. And oftentimes I have a lot of financial worries because something did happen where I lost money or something, or I grew up in a home where my mom and dad were very frugal or very worried themselves about finances because like they're bankrupt or something. And as a child, I always have to be worried about what's happening because my parents were so devastated. I need to be careful in case that happens to me. Or medical, like I have a hypochondriac, like you're always worried about you don't see it a lot of times. Your doctor may see it or other people, but it's where I'm always worried that something's going to happen medically. So, and that's because something did. So it's not bad to be concerned about it if it consumes you and you can't relax and recognize that I have a God greater than this, and that there are things that I could do. I could listen to, John Gallagher's podcast and learn more. I mean, that's one thing I could even do, right? Or
Right.
Go to Craig Miller's,
Goodness.
read his book, You're Breaking Emotion Barriers to
Yeah.
Heal, or whatever, pray to God about it and get prayer myself, or
Mm-hmm.
or do some research about it. So the point is,
Yep.
if I feel helpless, it's because it was given to you. That helpless was created at a certain time. I'm still feeling helpless as an adult now, and I can't get out of that. And we need to deal with the helplessness of where the origin came, because otherwise it's just perpetuating it right now as an adult, because it's something that I learned.
As a cycle. Yeah. There's something that you just shared that brought another question to mind. And that is when it comes to trauma, if you don't deal with trauma in a healthy way, I know I'm saying in a generical terms, but then that could lead to a form of anxiety, right? So, in fear, but we're mostly focusing on anxiety now. So, is kind of like I'm sure there's people watching like, okay, I I don't really want to have unhealthy anxiety. So, I'm thinking, well, maybe if there's such an influence of trauma when it comes to that in dealing with things through time in adulthood, is it knowing how to deal with? Is one of the solutions of being kind of a preventive measure towards unhealthy anxiety is knowing how to deal with trauma, both trauma in the present and in the past?
Right. Good question. All right. So again, because we don't have as much time, we're running out of time. But
We are.
in my book, okay, really, because in my book, I talk about just what you said, that that we have past and current trauma. All right,
Mm-hmm.
trauma creates physical trauma, emotional trauma, but our
Mm-hmm.
current medical establishment doesn't deal much with the emotional. I mean, the psychotherapists do, psychiatrists may do,
Mm-hmm.
but the point is, in the medicine, physical medicine, they'll tend to work on just the symptom. But
Mm-hmm.
so one thing we haven't gone into, and I think I talked about in my last podcast with you, is that when emotion comes into our body, it can create physical symptoms.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
why for the U.S. Center for Disease Control, they just changed last year. They just changed that now it's 92% of physical ailments have a psychological root. 92%.
Wow.
I
That's
think it's
high.
actually higher than that. It is. So your anxiety can actually create things like IBS and
Mm,
ADD and uh, um,
mm,
uh, chronic fatigue syndrome,
mm,
eventually things like fibromyalgia, Crohn's disease. I mean, it's because
mm,
the anxiety doesn't let my body energy to flow correctly, because the
mm,
emotion is stronger than my
mm,
ability to heal it,
mm,
and so that gets in the way. So we need to go back to the origin of when it happened, and oftentimes a current trauma will stir up old past traumas. And that's
mm,
why if the trauma happens now and you're not getting over it, it's because there's probably something in your past that was similar to it that wasn't brought up until now. Because
mm,
current small things that happen in adulthood often stir up old suppressed emotion that we dealt with, that we didn't deal with as a child or as a teenager or a young adult, that I put away, because our body, God made our body and minds an incredible ability to store things. By the time we die, we only use between 5 to 10% of our brain capacity. That's not a lot compared to all the things that
that's
we have. It's
wow.
small. And so
Very
the
small.
problem is, if we continue, so I see a lot of people in the 40s and 50s because it's an accumulation effect. What
Mm,
I call it, a saturation point, whereas
mm,
I can accumulate all these stresses and put them away, and then something small happens that triggers up a lot of similar emotion from the past, and then this is way bigger than it should be. That's
mm.
because you've been holding on to a lot, that this now is the trigger.
Wow. Wow. And I think that's good to leave off with a cliffhanger on some of this with the question, and then to do more of a deep dive into your book. Well, this has been such an incredible conversation, really, really eye-opening as well. And because I think a lot of people want to be set free, but they don't know how to be set free. And this really kind of sets the launching pad in getting that into a greater orbit of healing, if you will.
So go to the people can go to my website, Insights with an S, insightsfromtheheart.com. And then, of course, I've got several books out there on all kinds of ones. And there is along with this book, which I mentioned, Breaking Emotion Barriers to Healing, which is everything that we talked about. And the one after that, this is a workbook it's a very small book, How to Pray When Healing Doesn't Happen. And it really is, it's an advanced guidebook to actually going into how to continue to pray with it. So I tell people to get this book first, and then get this one, or read this one first, and then read How to Pray. And so it helps to make more sense that way.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. Well, guys, you need to check out Craig Miller's website. His books are available where bookstores are sold, especially on Amazon. And wow, this has been such a great and illuminating conversation regarding the topic of overcoming anxiety. Thank you again for being here with us today. And everyone, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this episode. For those that want to overcome anxiety or dealing with anxiety-related issues or fears of that sort, this is the episode that you need to share with them. And this provides some insights into digging into further truth on that. So thank you again, Craig, for being on.
You're welcome. God bless.
Thank you, everyone. Until next time, we'll see you soon.